because everything that you saw is necessarily going to happen, right? But some things have already happened. It's to kind of dramatize the fact of how fast the world is changing and how parts of the world that heretofore had not been getting a lot of attention now will be getting huge amounts of attention, just by raw scale. So the question for all of us is, so what do we do about that? Do we tap into those trends, or do we ignore them? Do we stay in old lanes of expectations and old lanes of presumptions that the only place to be a successful outside of Egypt entrepreneur is in the EU, is in the United States, is in large Japan? I would argue not, right, given the way the world is changing. So now let's talk and focus more about the changing nature of the economy, the global economy. I want to present to you a couple of facts, and these are facts, that dramatize how the global economy is changing and who the players are. So who are the economic leaders in today's world? The Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C. has created a concept called the $1 Trillion Club. These are countries who have their GDP of $1 trillion or more. This is the listing. You can actually see some interesting entrants and surprises. You can see that now China is the second largest economy in the world, surpassing Japan. If you knew that, what does that mean? If you didn't know that, it's pretty interesting, isn't it? Shatters a couple of existing barriers. India, coming up after surpassing Germany. What does that mean? If you knew that, if you didn't know that, what does it mean to you going forward? So these are the members of the $1 Trillion Club, whose GDPs in 2008, not a great year, right, 2008, were $1 trillion or more. Okay, let's go to the next. Now, I've added Egypt and South Africa, who are not members of the $1 Trillion Club, for illustration purposes for while we're here. This is how the members of the $1 Trillion Club's GDPs grew before the financial slowdown, were impacted by the financial slowdown, and are expected to grow after the financial slowdown, according to the IMF. Insert Egypt and South Africa. You can see China, India, Egypt, Brazil, South Africa, all pretty new players in a global world. Not the traditional G7 countries. Not the traditional countries that people talk about, that you have to have access to those markets in order to be successful. Now, in the far, you can see that the essence of this chart, which is busy, but I figured I was speaking to a number of engineers and you like data. So I figured if I was going to err on the side of something, I was going to err on the side of more data, not less data. The essence of this chart is that the developing growth countries have generally exhibited a better ability to weather the economic downturn than have the more advanced developed economies, right? And that the forecast for robust growth is better for those countries going forward. Now, let's think about the world economy in total. Well, who has the biggest share? This chart, I think, is very, very important to understand and to get a sense for trends. So the blue line represents the GDP's share, the developing countries' GDP share of the world economy. The red line represents the share of the developing countries' share of worldwide GDP. How the world will be different in 2024, only 15 years from now, when the developing economies and growth economies that we've been alluding to have a larger share of the worldwide GDP than the traditional countries who have occupied the decision-making roles in economics globally for the last 70 years. Profound shift. Okay? So it's one thing to have trends, it's another thing to have a good GDP, but do you have the resources to do what you want? So this chart gives you a sense for the countries, the members of the $1 Trillion Club, all right, and Egypt and South Africa, and their level of foreign currency reserves. How much money do they have in excess to do what they want with their economy and with their future? Right? That's a good situation to have. That means you have choices. So, look at China, Japan, Russia, India, all have 63% of the trillion-dollar club economies, foreign currency reserves are located in the developing countries as of last year. So these growth economies now have the money to do what they want. They're not just growing and dependent necessarily on somebody else. In fact, the opposite is true. The, quote, advanced economies, the developed countries, are dependent on others. So how does that rate against having reserves and having external debt? Well, this chart, look at the stark clustering of the red and the blue. Quite a separation. Right? And the essence is that the growth economies all have lower external debt as a percent to their GDP than do the mature economies. Now, when your external debt to your GDP is high, you are dependent upon others for everything. The world has flipped. Okay? So, in trying to give you a sense for the trends, what are the conclusions? My conclusions, at least, are that there's been a redistribution of economic assets in the world. It's important to recognize that. Economic vitality, vitality is the important word here, gives you the capacity to shift. The world is shifting away from the traditional drivers of worldwide growth, like the G7 countries, and toward the growth economies that we've discussed. And a country's ability to exercise freedom of action, economic freedom of action, will be determined by the economic profile, macroeconomic profile we're talking about here today. Okay. So, now let's shift and talk about what are the considerations that you, in my opinion, you should keep in mind if you want to engage and be a participant in this global economy, and hopefully succeed in it. So what idea, product, service do you have that others outside of Egypt will pay for and need? Obvious question. Next question may not be so obvious, which is, do you have a disruptive business model or do you have a disruptive technology? What do I mean by that? I'd like to take a show of hands. How many people think the iPod was a disruptive technology versus a disruptive business model? How many people think it was the iPod, the Apple iPod, was a disruptive technology to the market? Raise your hand if you think it was a disruptive technology. How many people think it was a disruptive business model? I agree with you. Okay. Now, what about CNN? Think back many years ago. Disruptive business model. It took cable television and said, we're going to make it all news all the time. And it has forced every other entity in the broadcasting and media business to shift toward that. Right? What about Google? Disruptive technology or disruptive business model? How many people vote for disruptive business model? And to whom? Media companies. It's a media company. It only uses search to be a new age media company. It is putting newspapers out of business. That's what I mean by a disruptive business model or a disruptive technology. It's important for you to think about which path are you going down. Now, does your product, service, or idea help other people grow, or does it just help them optimize their own operations? What do I mean by that? Do you help somebody get new customers, new revenue by your product or service, or are you just helping them be more efficient, more cost-effective? It's an important factor to consider. Go ahead. Do you have a sense for the macroeconomic and market access trends? We spent a lot of time on that. And what about the technology trends? Important to keep an eye on what the technology trends are so that you can utilize technology to the degree that it makes sense for your own business strategy.